So this is the newest version of the as-is contract. The way you can tell is at the bottom of the contract, it will tell you when it was last revised. And so this is 1224 is the last revision. So this is the most current version of the contract, or the as-is version 7 right here. What's funny is that I'm not the third, so I don't know why it has me as Richard Alpizar the third. It's kind of funny. But anyway, the parties, obviously seller, buyer. When you're filling in the parties, you want to make sure you're writing full names. So if it's like Jim and Jane Smith that own it, you want to put Jim Smith and Jane Smith. Make sure you have both of their complete names for the buyer and for the seller. Proper description on line 7, the address, what county it's located in, and then the property tax ID can be found by going to the property appraiser's website for that county and looking that up, as well as the legal description can be found there. So one shortcut you could do is in the MLS, you can click on tax information and it will show up both of these things. The legal description is the most important thing on the contract in terms of the address. So you could have a typo in the address as long as the legal description and the property tax ID are correct, because that is what the title company is going to be using to transfer the property. So when property is transferred on the deed, it will have the address, but more importantly, the title insurance is going to be based on legal description. So it will be like lot 65 in Watergrass, whatever it is. Sometimes the legal description is very long. It can be like coordinates. And so you want to make sure that you have the complete legal description in there. Now, there are things that are automatically included in the contract that you need to be aware of so that you can make sure that you're informing your buyers and sellers. The first thing is the first things that are included are all of the appliances, all of the built-in furnishings. So if there's a wall unit or a built-in office, closet system, those are all built-in furnishings that are attached to the wall. All flooring is included. And then under personal property on line 15, automatically included in every contract is all of the ovens, ranges, refrigerators. And so if there's a garage fridge or there's a uh, wine fridge, a bar fridge, even if it's not plugged in, if it's on the property at the time of contract, it is automatically included unless on line 24 it is excluded as a an item. Now, the MLS may say that the refrigerator in the kitchen is not included, or that the light fixture in the dining room is not included. The the contract supersedes the MLS. So even though the MLS says the refrigerator is not included, if the contract doesn't disclude it, then it stays. And so a lot of times people will get into trouble because they'll just assume that whatever the MLS says is going to be what's happening. But if you're not protecting yourself in the contract, you can end up in some hot water where, you owe somebody a fridge that you gave away. So dishwashers, disposals, all fans, all light fixtures, all window treatments. So all draperies, drapes, blinds, shutters, um, and then now it includes thermostats. So smart thermostats, smart doorbells, any kind of keys, any kind of storm protection, shutters, pool fence, all of that is included automatically, unless it is specifically excluded. And then what you don't see here that is commonplace in contracts is the washer and dryer. So the washer and dryer is not included, and so it must be added on line 21 here as part of other personal property items. The other items that could go here is if there's patio furniture or electronics or anything else that is of the seller's personal property, that would be listed here. Now, the next thing is the next line, line 23, is very important because it says that the personal property items are included as part of the contract at no contributory value, which means that these items are not adding value to the property and these items are not being paid for. And so these are just bonus items that are being thrown in as part of the contract. And so if a home is being sold fully furnished, you could put, a separate addendum that outlines all of the personal property and attach it to the contract. understanding that personal property is not going to add any value to the contract. So a home that sells fully furnished and a home that sells that's not fully furnished, in an appraiser's mind, is going to be worth exactly the same. There's not really any value that's given. And so if the seller is giving these things away, it's just as a bonus. If the seller wanted some money for these items, you could create a separate addendum that said that doesn't get sent anywhere, just a separate addendum between the buyer and the seller that says that these items are going to stay as part of the contract for this price. And the items will only be sold if the property sells. So it's contingent on the property sale. Any questions so far about this first section?
No. No.
Okay, okay. All right, Nicole, you're still with me?
Yes. My computer was just issues.
No sweat. This is being recorded, and so I'll post it on YouTube later so you can review it. It's going to be really in depth, and so I want you to be able to go back and replay anything that you need. So section two, pretty straightforward. Line 27 is the purchase price. Initial deposit, otherwise known as escrow, would go on line 28. It's typically 1% of the purchase price, but this is completely negotiable. So you actually don't even need to put anything down on for escrow if you don't want to. It would be foolish for someone to accept an offer without an escrow payment, but it's not a requirement of an executed contract. You would mark that the escrow is typically you would mark item two, that it's to be made within 3 days of the effective date. And so if the box is not checked, it's automatically assumed that number two is chosen. However, I would like you to get into the practice of filling in every line, even if leaving it blank defaults to a certain thing that you're okay with, because someone could come in and check a box for you after the fact, and you would have no way of proving it wasn't there to begin with, or they can add a number here that you don't like. It happens every once in a while. It's not as common anymore, but you just want to make sure that you're filling in everything that can be filled in. Escrow agent is usually the title company. If for some reason the other real estate office is holding escrow, that happens sometimes. And so they would be put here as the person holding escrow. 99% of the time, it's the same as the title company. Iron Valley does not hold escrow, but the title company does. We prefer that the title company hold escrow at all times. It's too much liability for us. The next section is 36. If there's an additional deposit, in some cases, especially with cash transactions, there may be two rounds of deposit. So the buyer puts down 10%, and then maybe after the inspection period, they put down another 10%. Again, completely optional, but that is typically when you would see it as during a cash transaction. Or if there's a transaction that has a very long closing period, they may get a deposit, like let's say it's a 90-day close. You may get a deposit up front, and then after a certain point, have another deposit that's non-refundable to protect the seller in case something falls through. Line 39 is about financing. So you're going to express this as a dollar amount or a percentage of what's being financed. So an FHA loan is going to be financed at 96.5%. And so you would put 96.5% here, or you would put the dollar amount of whatever 96.5 represents. Then the balance to close is an equation that is the purchase price minus the initial deposit minus what's being financed leaves the balance. So basically the remainder of the down payment is what you're putting here for balance to close. So, if you have a $100,000 property, they're financing 95% of it. They're putting $1,000 down in escrow. So you have 100,000 minus 1,000 minus 95,000 leaves you with $4,000 of a balance to close. So you'll see here, this does not include the buyer's closing costs or prepaids. This is strictly the remainder of their down payment. And so I make sure that if you're doing counter offers, if you're going back and forth and you change the purchase price, that's going to change the equation on line 41 as well. So make sure that you're going back and correcting these parts as well. Now, at the end of the day, if the purchase price is correct and the escrow is correct and the financing number is correct, but you did the math incorrectly on the balance to close, it's not a deal breaker. It's just going to be embarrassing. It's just going to make you look bad, but it's not really going to affect anything catastrophically with the contract. The next section is section 3. This is the time for acceptance. And so when you are delivering an offer, it has an expiration date. And so that's what you're putting here. So you typically should allow 24 hours for a response. After 24 hours, the offer is technically null and void. That doesn't mean that you can't continue to negotiate, but if the seller signs after the if they sign after the expiration, then the buyer doesn't have to honor it. So the reason you would put an expiration date is because you want to incentivize the buyer to work with you quickly. You don't want to give them too much time because that incentivizes them to try to get other offers or to try to negotiate or try to find something else. And so what is frustrating is sometimes sellers and sellers agents will not honor your expiration date. And so this is something that you want to make sure you're giving yourself enough time. And if you are running out of time, understand that you don't have to accept it if they go past the deadline. Technically, it says here that time for acceptance for any counteroffers is 2 days. And so I think that's a little long, but that's what is standard. And so if you submit the offer, they get back to you within 24 hours. That means that from that time they get back to you with the counter, you have 2 days to negotiate. Now let's talk about days and how they're calculated. This is very, very important. You should write this down with 6 stars next to it. This is the most important takeaway from today because understanding this concept is going to help you understand every other concept and timeline in the contract. And that is the concept of the effective date. So the effective date is the date that the last of the buyer or seller has signed, initialed, and delivered the contract back to the other party. So if you send an offer tonight, it gets signed by all parties tonight and it gets delivered back to you tonight, then tonight is the effective date. Even if you get the contract at 11:59 p.m. tonight, today is the effective date. If all parties sign today, but you don't get a copy of the fully executed contract until tomorrow morning, then tomorrow morning is the effective date. So that's what's confusing because the contract dates are going to say today's date, but because you did not get delivery of it until tomorrow, tomorrow is the effective date. And so you need to make sure that you understand that you can go effective on any day of the year. So you could have an effective date of Christmas Day, New Year's Day. It doesn't matter. Like any day of the year can be the effective date. All of the time periods in the contract begin from the effective date. So I'm going to jump around for a second since we're on the concept of dates. So the timelines that you want to consider, number one is the escrow. So escrow is typically 3 days from the effective date. So that's the first timeline to consider. Second timeline to consider is in line 72. If the property is subject to lease or occupancy after closing, which means that there's a lease in place, you have 5 days from the effective date to get a copy of the lease, and 5 days after that to determine if the lease is acceptable to you or to the buyer. If the lease is not acceptable to the buyer can terminate this contract at any time. So this doesn't always apply to every situation, but this is definitely a timeline in the contract that is important to recognize. I'm going to scoot down to the inspection period. So this is section 12, line 260 on page 5. There's a reason that this entire section is in bold. This is one of the most important parts of the entire contract. So the property inspection timeline has a date here. It can be anything that you want. Now, if you're on the buyer side, you want as much time as possible. If you're on the seller side, you want this number to be as small as possible. The buyer can cancel during the inspection period at any time for any reason, Even if they haven't performed any inspections, they could just wake up one day and have a change of heart. They don't have to give a reason. They don't have to give an inspection report. They can do whatever they want. My favorite line in this contract is right here, line 263. If buyer determines in buyer's sole discretion that the property is not acceptable to the buyer, buyer may terminate this contract by delivering written notice of such election to the seller prior to the expiration of the inspection period. So let's say today is our effective date. So today is the 23rd. You have 7 days for inspection here. So you have until 11:59 p.m. next Wednesday to cancel this contract. So if you don't submit by 11:59 p.m. that you wish to cancel, it is assumed that you are moving forward and you are waiving the rest of your inspection period. So even if you're in the middle of negotiations and things are looking good, if you don't have a fully signed agreement before the end of the inspection period, your buyer is at significant risk because the seller or the listing agent can just decide not to play with you anymore and they can just completely take advantage of the buyer and not operate in good faith, and they would be legally protected. And so this inspection period is very important. Let's talk about how days are calculated. So let's say that we had a 10-day inspection period. So we were effective today, which is Wednesday. We have a 10-day inspection period, which would take us to next Saturday. Per the contract, and I'm going to find it here. There's a time of the essence at the bottom. Thing is line 430. All of the days on the contract are computed using calendar days, not business days. It's always calendar days. However, if a time period ends on a Saturday, Sunday, or national legal public holiday, or a day that the holiday is observed, then the time period shall extend to the next calendar day, which is not a weekend or a holiday. So in our example, if our 10 days for the inspection period is up next Saturday, that effectively automatically extends until the end of the day on Monday, assuming that Monday is not a holiday. So you can be shrewd when you write your contracts and you can ask for a 10-day inspection and really end up with a 12-day inspection period without having to ask for it because you understand how the time periods are calculated. And so most agents don't know this. A lot of people assume that you can't go effective on a weekend. A lot of people assume that the dates are business days, or they assume that the time period ends at 5 o'clock, or which it used to be 5 p.m. in former versions of the contract. So people don't understand that it's changed now to actually mean the end of day. So I always like to say 11:59 p.m. That way there's no confusion when you say midnight. So I'm going to go back up now and pick up where we left off on the contract. So we understand what the effective date is. We understand how time periods are calculated. Closing date. Ironically, the closing date is one of the least important dates on the contract, believe it or not, because all the other things in the contract and time periods have to be satisfied before we can even get to closing. But this is where you would put closing date here. You can write in here that closing shall occur on a specific date. You can write in here that closing shall occur on or before a specific date. If you write a closing will occur on or before this date, that doesn't mean that the other party is forced to close early if they don't want to. So if you write that you can close on or before the 30th of May, and you're ready to, and the buyer's ready to close on the 17th of May, that doesn't mean that the seller has to. And so the on or before date is still kind of a little bit extra because you still need the other party to, even if they agree to close on or before, they're not agreeing to a specific date. And so you always want to have the buyer and seller agree on what the specific closing date is going to be. Now, a best practice here when you're choosing a closing date, I highly recommend that you choose either a Tuesday, Wednesday, or Thursday. Monday closings are very difficult because that means that the title company has to have the package the business day before, which is a Friday, and not a lot of things happen, from Friday to Monday. And so it's always safer to do closing midweek You don't want to do closings on Friday because if something goes wrong and there's a delay or there's an issue at the walkthrough and you need to push it forward a day, you now have to wait the entire weekend. And so expert agents will have closings on in middle of the week. That way, if there's a delay of a day or two, you're not pushing an entire weekend. So if someone had their heart set on moving in this weekend or moving out this weekend, that doesn't wreck everything. And so also title companies are the busiest on Friday. And so everything's just a little bit more stressful. And so I would also try to avoid closing on the last day of the month. The last day of the month is typically a busy time. And if the last day of the month is a Friday, well, God help you. It's going to be really hard to get everything done on time. You want the closing day and the time around the closing to be as stress-free as possible. Now, the closing date can be extended for one of two reasons. So, per the guidelines with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, say that 5 times fast, the buyer has to receive a copy of their closing disclosure 3 days before closing. So that way there's no surprise to the buyer of what they have to bring to the table so they can prepare their wire. Now, the closing disclosure that's issued 3 days before closing does not have to be accurate. In fact, it can be wrong. It just can't be wrong and be too low. So oftentimes the lenders will inflate the closing disclosure and send it out as a way of jumping through this hoop because the law states that as long as the closing costs are equal to or less than what they were disclosed as, then there's no issue. If there's a problem where the actual closing costs are higher than what was disclosed, then that would force an extension of at least 3 days so that the disclosure could be reissued to the buyer. And so if that happens, it's not up to the buyer or the seller. They don't have a choice. They have to extend. So the buyer cannot waive this right. They can't say, look, I'm fine with it. I don't need the extra time. I'm comfortable paying more. They don't have a choice because it's the lender that's held responsible by this federal bureau to give the 3 day disclosure. And Saturday does count as one of the days, but not Sunday. Very confusing, I know. Don't worry about it. The lender will know. The second thing that can cause an extension of the closing date is an act of God or force majeure. And so that's if there's a hurricane or a powder outage or a flood and you can't get to the title, you can't get to the title office to close, or you can't get insurance because it's not being bound. Because if there's a hurricane that's too close to the state of Florida, insurance companies will stop issuing new policies. And so if you can't have a policy issued, then you can't close, and therefore you can extend from here. COVID is not an act of God. So you could have COVID, explosive diarrhea, whatever the case is, that is not an act of God. A sickness is not an act of God. Actually, as morbid as it seems, somebody dying is not even an act of God. The contract would survive somebody's death. And so that is something for you to keep in mind. We touched on this next section, occupancy and possession. If for some reason the seller is going to be staying in the property after closing, which is known as a post-closing occupancy, or the buyer is going to take possession of the property before closing, which is a terrible idea, or if there's renters in place in the property, then a lease should be in place and it should be approved by all parties before moving forward. And so if you have an investor who's buying a property that's tenant occupied, you need to see a copy of the lease and you need to see a copy of the rent roll and any other documentation that shows that they've been paying on time. And the buyer needs to feel warm and fuzzy about it. And if they don't, then they have the ability to cancel. The next section, oh, sorry, section 7 is assignability. So assigning the contract is basically letting someone else take over as a party on the contract. And so you'll see this with some investors and wholesalers. They'll put a property under contract and then they'll sell that contract to somebody else. And so they'll go under agreement to buy a property for $120,000 and then they'll try to find someone that will give them $125,000 for that property. They'll assign that contract and they'll make the $5,000 difference for just having connected the parties. And so it is my professional opinion that you should always mark may not assign option C on the contract, because only things can go sideways if a contract is assigned. If a contract is assigned, that means that someone may be getting taken advantage of, and it really clouds and muddies the water. So I would avoid that. So always mark this. Even if you don't mark it, it's going to be assumed that you've chosen C, but please, as I said before, always mark the box. Don't leave anything to chance. All right. Take a breath here for a second. We're going to load in the financing section, which is pretty intense. So, two options here in section 8. Option A is it's a cash transaction. Option B is that it's a financed transaction. The financing protection, otherwise known as the loan approval period, is going to be a certain period of time from the effective date. The timing matters. This is an advanced thing to understand. If you're on the buyer's side of the contract, you want the loan approval period to be as close to the closing date or beyond the closing date. If you're on the listing side, you want the loan approval period to be as short as possible and as far away from the closing date as possible. This just depends on how you're protecting your client. During the loan approval period, two things have to happen. Number one is the buyer has to receive a full loan approval or what's known as a conditional loan approval. So those mean the same thing. So full loan approval and conditional loan approval mean the same thing. A conditional loan approval means that the buyer is approved, but they have a couple of conditions to satisfy that are completely within their control. So maybe they have to get insurance, or we're waiting for the appraisal to come in, or they need to pay off a credit card or something like that. Those conditions are usually within the buyer's control. Now, if the buyer receives a full loan approval and they fail to close because they don't meet the conditions, then the buyer no longer has protection because the whole hurdle that had to be cleared was just getting the conditional loan approval from the lender. So if the buyer messes it up from there, they don't have the protection. The second thing that has to happen during this time period is you have to have a satisfactory appraisal. And so it is the lender that orders the appraisal, the buyer pays for it. The appraisal is a double blind process. So the lender nor the buyer know who the appraiser is going to be until they actually go out and perform the appraisal. So that appraisal has to come in before the end of the loan approval period, and it has to come in at the value of the property or higher. So what happens if the buyer does not get approved or the appraisal comes in low? If the appraisal comes in low or the buyer doesn't get approved, then they have the option of backing out of the contract if they want and receiving their full escrow deposit back, as long as it happens during the timeline. So this is why this timeline is very important that you're tracking. If you are coming up against the end of your loan approval period and you haven't gotten these two things satisfied, you must extend the loan approval period and or the closing date. It is not enough to extend the closing date. The closing date does not give you any protection. The loan approval period gives you protection. So you must extend it. The seller, if the appraisal comes in low, there's a couple things that can happen. The buyer can walk away if they want to, or the seller can lower the price to match the appraisal. If the seller lowers the price to match the appraisal, the buyer must continue with the transaction because now the purchase price has matched the appraisal. The buyer and seller can negotiate and meet in the middle. So the buyer can bring cash outside of closing and the seller can lower their price a little bit to make it happen. So you can get creative here if there's a gap that needs to be closed. But if the gap is too large, then you cancel the contract, cut the buyer loose, and they get their deposit back. And so if the time period passes for the loan approval, just like the inspection period, if the time period passes and no one has said anything, then it's assumed that they've waived it and that everything's good. So if they get denied for their loan or the appraisal comes in and it happens the day after the loan approval period is over, they have zero protection. And so that's what the next kind of paragraphs here outline is that if there's a problem, it needs to be addressed in writing to the other party during this time period to keep your protection. And so in the contract, you're going to fill in how many days for loan approval, what kind of contract it is, what kind of loan it is, conventional FHA, VA. Another loan would be like a private mortgage or a USDA mortgage, something like that. And then whether the interest rate is going to be fixed or adjustable or either. And then on line 92, you would write what the interest rate not that you would not exceed looks like. And so this is another way for you to protect your buyer. So if the prevailing interest rates are around 6%, um, you might put 7% here, just in case interest rates go up during your contract. So let's say in the 3 weeks that you're under contract, interest rates go up, or the buyer's credit is such that he can only qualify for a mortgage at an interest rate above 7%. This gives you another trigger to pull if you need to cancel the contract. So let's say they get approved and the appraisal comes in, but the interest rate is at 7.25%, then the buyer can determine if they want to continue or not. So this is another shrewd way for you to protect your buyer in this situation. And so again, I would on the buyer side put as many days as you can get away with on line 89, and then put an interest rate that's as low as you can get away with here to protect your buyer. Because just because they're able to get a loan, it doesn't mean that, if they should accept whatever percentage is given to them. Moving down, this section here, line 97, the buyer should make application for financing within blank number of days. Now, typically, when you are putting an offer in, you are attaching a pre-approval letter to that, which means that the buyer has already submitted an application and received the pre-approval before you put the offer in. And so therefore, you can put 0 or 1 days here because you already have a pre-approval in hand. It's unlikely that you would get an offer accepted without showing a pre-approval letter. And most lenders these days won't give you a pre-approval letter unless you've made a full application for financing with them. Buyer should use good faith and diligent effort to obtain their loan approval, which means that they can't just change their mind and sit on their hands. And so let's say that they're outside of the inspection period and they change their mind and they think, well, if I just sit on my hands and don't cooperate with anyone, don't give them any paperwork, and I just kind of ghost everybody, that I'll be let go of the terms of the contract. That is not true. There is no immature exit strategy in this contract. So if the buyer does not use good faith and diligent effort to obtain their loan approval, then they could be held in default and they could lose their escrow deposit because they were not acting in good faith. This also, this next section 106 gives the buyer, is the buyer giving permission for everyone to check in with the mortgage company. So sometimes if it's a large mortgage company and you call them as a listing agent for an update on the loan, they'll say, oh, we can't talk to you because you're not a party on the loan. You can say, well, actually, yes, the contract states that the buyer has given me permission to contact you to get updates on the loan and the appraisal and so forth. And so it is your right as the listing agent to be in communication. In fact, it's your job as the listing agent to be in communication with the buyer's mortgage company to make sure everything's moving along well. Don't count on the buyer to do the job. It's your job to make sure things are going well. If you're nearing the end of a loan approval period and the appraisal hasn't even been ordered yet, you need to know that so that you can protect your seller and let them know, hey, we're coming up against the time period here. And so, the buyer may not have the appraisal back. And so they're not going to be as protected. So you always want to make sure that regardless of which side of the transaction you're on, you're kind of doing the work of the other party as well and not just leaving it up to them. You have to just assume that you're the more experienced and better agent and not assume that even if the person you've been working with on the other side has been doing it forever, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're good at it. And so you want to make sure that you're always aware of what's happening. So these next sections here are what I already went over. Section 9 is closing costs. So this goes over the customary closing costs that are paid by the seller and the buyer in a transaction. And so this is just kind of letting everyone know what's typical for each party to pay. Um, Moving down, uh, title insurance, at least 15 days prior to closing, you should have a title insurance commitment. So the title company, when they get the contract, they're going to run a lien search. They're going to run a permit, maybe a permit search. They're going to make sure that the title is clear and free of any defects. And so a defect in the title would be like if there's not a legible copy available with the court system, or there's a typo in someone's name, or there's a lien on the property, or there's an issue of ownership. These are all issues that the title company is going to be checking out. And when they issue a title commitment, that's basically a guarantee that the title is clear and ready to be transferred. And so if there's an issue with the title policy, the title company will let you know, and then you'll have to figure out what to do with that. And the title company will help kind of guide you. But I don't want to get too caught up in that now. It's just important to know that one of the main responsibilities of the title company up front is going to be making sure that the title is all good. So maybe there was a seller on the title that wasn't listed on the contract. They'll catch that. They'll have a change made. Maybe one of the owners on the title has passed away, and so title will have to work on getting like a death certificate or something like that. We're going to breeze through the rest of this, I promise. I already went through the heavy things. Here in line 172 on page 4, we're going to be looking at who chooses the title company and who's paying for the owner's title policy. So in Florida, outside of Miami-Dade and Broward County, it is customary for the seller to choose the closing agent or the title company and therefore pay the owner's title policy. And then the buyer will just pay, whatever their customary closing costs are. If the buyer insists on choosing the title company, then they are agreeing to pay for the owner's title policy and everything else. So with every um, closing, there's at least um, two policies, two title insurance policies that are written. One is the owner's policy that protects the owner of the property, and the other is the lender's title policy. So the owner and the lender each get their own title insurance. And so the seller usually pays for the owner's policy, and the buyer usually pays for the lender's policy. Now, you may be asking yourself, why would a buyer choose a title company when they have to pay more? Well, this is an event where maybe the buyer is closing on one property and trying to buy the next property on the same day. It's called a simultaneous closing. So it would be to the buyer's advantage to have the money from their first closing already at the title company so they don't have to wire in and wire out twice in one day. It could be that the buyer really loves this title company and they know the people and they trust them. You can negotiate this. So the buyer can insist on choosing the title agency and still ask the seller pay the owner's title policy. So everything can be negotiated, but typically, if the buyer's insisting on choosing a closing agent, then they're usually willing to pay for the owner's policy. So something that you want to make sure that you're checking here is that the seller will designate most of the time. Next section, survey. The title company will order a survey of the property. It is only required if there's not a current survey available and it's a financed property. If it's a cash transaction, a survey is optional. And so the title company will coordinate ordering the survey before closing. Home warranty. This is if you want to include the home warranty as part of the contract, it would go here. You would mark who's paying for it, what company is going to be issuing the home warranty, and what the cost not to exceed is going to look like. If you don't select a home warranty here, it's not the end of the world. You can add a home warranty almost at any time up until closing, and some companies will even allow you to purchase a policy 30 days after closing. And so if you miss this section, it's no big deal. But if you know ahead of time that maybe the seller is already offering a home warranty, this is where you would put it. Next section is special assessments. Special assessments has nothing to do with HOA or condo associations. That's typically where you're going to hear about special assessments. But as you can see here, this does not include condo or HOAs. This is a special assessment from a public body, so the government. So, for example, the city decides that they're going to install sewer lines in a neighborhood instead of and have everyone come off the septic, the city is going to charge you a prorated amount for whatever it costs them for your property to install sewer. And that will become a special assessment that will go on your taxes that you'll have to pay for either in a lump sum or over a period of time. Another example is if they add street lights or something, some improvement to the area that's done by the city or other government body, they will usually pass on that expense to you. And so this is very important because if you have the seller, you want to make sure you're marking A, where everyone pays their installments. So like the seller will pay the installments while they own the property, and the buyer will take over installments after closing for the rest of the amount. If you have the buyer, you want the seller to pay all of the assessments in full before closing. And so you want to make sure, like I said, if you have the buyer, you want to mark B. If you have the seller, you always want to mark A. You may not know of any special assessments that exist at the time. If you're on the listing side of the transaction, you should know because it's a part of the seller's disclosures that were filled out. But in any case, to protect yourself, you always want to mark the box where your client is at the advantage. And again, if neither box is checked, that's a bad thing. We've already learned that. That's a no-no in our world. But if you happen not to check either box, then option A is going to be chosen where the seller pays everything. Everyone good so far? No one's passed out yet?
No.
Oh, good.
Great. All right. Next section is disclosures. This is the typical disclosures that people should be aware of. Radon gas, very rare, but naturally occurring. Usually you see it in basements or in properties where there's a lot of natural stone. So a lot of travertine, a lot of marble, a lot of granite. You'll usually see that radon gas. I've only seen it once in my career, and it was not in Florida. It was in a basement in Missouri. So don't worry about that. Permit disclosure. If there's any open permits, the seller needs to let you know. If any work has been done without permits, the seller needs to let you know. And the seller has an obligation to help you identify and close out permits that were not closed out before. So that's what this section says. Mold is naturally occurring. Your property may be in a flood zone. There's a separate flood zone disclosure. An elevation certificate is a form of a survey that tells you how far above sea level the home sits. So what's the elevation of the home? So if you're in a flood zone, an elevation certificate is a must-have because that will tell the insurance company how much of a flood risk are you. So you may be in a flood zone, but your home may be built up on like stilts or on a crawl space. And so even though you're in a flood zone, your property may sit like 6 feet above sea level. And so therefore, that shows the insurance company that you're less of a risk. And so whenever you hear flood zone, you always want to ask about elevation certificate because this is very important. Moving forward, energy brochure, they acknowledge they received an energy brochure. We don't usually give this out, but it is available in SkySlope. That just tells people what energy efficiency is, what to look for. Next is lead-based paint. Any property built before 1978, regardless if there's lead-based paint or not, must include this lead-based paint disclosure. HOA, property tax. This basically says, look, property taxes can't be guaranteed. We have historical numbers, but that doesn't mean that that's what the data is going, what the number is going to be in the future. Sometimes a sale will trigger a reset of a property tax calculation. Homestead may or may not apply. And so we can't guarantee that's what it is. We can only tell people this is what the taxes are, but we can't promise them what it's going to be. That gets us in really hot water because they'll be like, hey, you told me this is my taxes and my taxes went up 20%. And that's not on us. That's for them to figure out. And that's just, we have no control over death or taxes as powerful as we may be. Homeowners Association, obviously, you don't want the buyer to sign the contract until they've received the HOA disclosure. So typically that becomes part of the contract. We'll talk about some of this more when we talk over an inspection period. Next is FIRPTA, which is foreign investment in real estate. So if the seller in the transaction is not a US citizen, if they're a foreign national, then you must let the title company know because there are special tax implications that they have when they sell their property. Seller's disclosure should be made part of the contract. It is the seller's requirement and the listing agent's requirement legally to disclose any facts that affect the material value of the home. So material value of the home is actual like physical value. So broken windows, roof leaks, any damage that is not readily observable needs to be disclosed. Now, things that are not material value are things that are stigmas or personal preference. And so, for example, um, bad schools or high crime or there being like a murder in the house or something like that, none of those things affect the material value of the home. So an appraiser that goes to the house that doesn't know the history of the home is not going to take any of that into consideration. So again, as the listing agent and the seller, they are required to tell you all of the things that materially affect the physical condition of the home. Next section, property maintenance. The seller has an obligation to maintain the property in the same state it was when you went under contract. And so they got to cut the lawn, take care of the pool, keep the power on, keep the water on, so on and so forth. Section 12, again, inspection period. Now, as a buyer's agent, you have a lot of things to accomplish within the inspection period. So you want to give yourselves as much time as possible. I would say at least 10 days. If you can get more, ask for more. Because during this time, you have to get the uh, inspection ordered. It has to be performed. You have to get the report back. You have to review the report, send the report to the insurance company so you can get accurate quotes. Make sure that you get the quotes back, that they're satisfactory to the buyer, negotiate any repairs that need to be done, and have a fully executed addendum that addresses any repairs or credits that have to happen all before the end of the inspection period. The property inspection period, you should also in the back of your mind think of it as the insurance inspection period. If for some reason you you can't get insurance or the insurance that you can get is ridiculously expensive, you need to know that before the end of the inspection period so that you can either extend or cancel. If you find out after the end of the inspection period that, yeah, we can get insurance, but it's going to be $5,000 a year, the buyer has no protection. Unless the insurance causes him to no longer qualify for the loan, then you don't really have any protection. So I would not rely on that other loophole. I would get all of these things done during the inspection period. So the first 2 weeks after the effective date is going to be the busiest for you as a buyer's agent because all of these things have to happen. In addition to that, the buyer has to be making sure that they're submitting their loan docs to the lender and making sure that they're on top of everything else. And so this is a get out of jail free card, right? You can use this time period to get out for any time for any reason. So make sure you're using it to your full advantage and doing as much work as you can during this time period. Walk through and reinspection. So either the day of closing or the day before closing, you have a right to go in and do a walkthrough. And all you're doing is you're solely confirming that all of the property is in the same condition it was in when you went under contract and any personal property that you agree to stay is there. If there were any repairs that needed to be done before closing, this is the time to go in and re-inspect for those repairs. I prefer to do this the day before closing because again, if there's a problem, like if you show up and there's still the seller's items are there or there's damage or a repair wasn't done, you have more time to figure out a solution than having to scramble the day of closing. Typically, you can get an addendum done where the buyer is getting a credit from the seller or something that fixes the issue pretty quickly so that closing is not delayed. As I mentioned before, the next section talks about the seller is required to assist and cooperate with the closing out of permits. And then any warranties or repair contracts will be assigned to the buyer if possible at closing, and the buyer will pay for that. So if there's a roof warranty or a home warranty or an AC warranty or something like that, the seller must assign it if possible to the buyer. All right, that's the thick of the contract right there. Next sections are just the escrow agent, what they do. Our professional liability as a broker, or you as a broker, we aren't lawyers, we aren't tax professionals, we aren't contractors, inspectors. All we are messengers. We peddle information and we negotiate, and that's really what we do. We can't offer any expert opinion outside of that scope. This is what happens if a buyer defaults or if a seller defaults. This is the dispute resolution that happens. If there's a conflict that arises and it can't be solved within 10 days, then it will either go to arbitration or mediation. This is who pays the fees. This next section of the standards. So this is like the basic definitions of everything in the contract, what title is, what it does, what a survey is. We talked about time. We talked about force majeure. Um, Closing location. This says the closing should be conducted by an attorney or closing agent, and it should take place in the county where the real property is located, unless another location is agreed to by the parties. And so it doesn't have to happen in any particular place. If our title company is in Orlando and we're doing a closing in Tampa, we can use the Orlando title office as long as the buyer and seller agree to it. And so typically the title company will make arrangements for a mobile closing or remote closing to happen to convenience the parties that are involved. Let's see. Property access. So the seller must provide access to do appraisal, inspection, walkthrough, utilities. And so during the inspection period, the seller has to allow as many inspections as the buyer is willing to pay for. So if the buyer wants to do 4 inspections, the seller has to allow it with proper notice. And proper notice is usually defined as 24 hours. And so obviously it's not fair to have give the seller 15 minutes notice that something's happening. Lastly, as we scroll down here, this is where you would mark any addenda that go with the contract. The contract is a document that doesn't know anything else. So the contract doesn't know what the MLS says. The contract doesn't know if there's addenda or not out there unless they're marked here. So if you have a property that has an HOA, you have to mark the HOA addenda here and attach it as part of the contract. If it's an FHA loan, you're going to mark it in the financing section and you should also mark it here. If there's another type of addendum that doesn't automatically apply but belongs with the contract, it must be marked. So for example, if there's going to be a post-closing occupancy or if the sale is contingent on the buyer's sale of their property, it has to be included here. You also want to attach the seller's agreement with respect to buyer broker compensation as part of the contract. As a buyer's agent, it is your responsibility to make sure that you are communicating with the listing agent to figure out what you're getting paid and who's paying. Is it the seller that's paying or is it the listing agent that's paying? And you want to have that agreement drafted and signed and attached to this contract as well. Basically giving you extra protection, saying that this contract is dependent on this form. And so if that form isn't filled out at the time, then it doesn't get attached to this contract. So you want to make sure that when you have a final agreement and you're fully executing everything, you want to make sure that everything is all nice and neat and together. The details matter very much here. Then this last section is additional terms. So section 20 is where you would fill in any kind of additional terms that are outside the other options in the contract. So this is where you'd put seller credit. So if you were asking the seller to credit $5,000 towards the buyer's closing cost, this is where you would indicate it. So you'd write seller to credit $5,000 towards buyer's closing cost. If there was something else that needed to happen, like seller to clean carpets prior to closing, that would go here as well. Anything that doesn't get put here can always be done as an addendum later on, but doing it here is clean because it makes it part of the contract. And so you want to make sure that if you're asking for closing costs, that they're listed here. If the seller has promised that they're going to do something, that it's listed here. Then lastly, that's it. That's the initials. Everyone signs initials, make sure the names are included here of the parties that are involved, and that every page is signed at the bottom.